I find myself spending a lot of time thinking about herds and the dynamics of herds. And it's not just because I spend a lot of time with my own herd, but ever since the pandemic started, it almost feels as if we'd entered into a kind of herd economy. The way in which supply and demand, or the cycles of supply and demand, have been disrupted. And we see kind of a herd approach to buying things. Initially, of course, it was toilet paper. Then it started to apply to things like baking and webcams. And I remember in June it was lumber. There's also all sorts of chicken raising and chicks. And anything related to homesteading, quite frankly, has these types of demand loops. Don't you think, Leon? Harriet? But fundamentally, it speaks to the way in which knowledge drives our economy. That as people have had the time at home alone to research how they want to improve themselves, to research greater self-sufficiency and resilience, well, that knowledge creates a kind of herd mentality, which I'm not criticizing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I actually think it ties back to our notion of survival as mammals, but also the wisdom that sometimes comes in crowds. Now, of course, the danger with herd behavior is when other people take advantage of it, when it leads to gouging or price speculation. Because here in Eastern Ontario, we've seen the same thing happen with hay this year. That because we had a really dry summer and then a very wet end of summer, it's made hay production really difficult and there's been a kind of scarcity. While that would normally drive prices up in very modest ways, it's created opportunities for speculation. It's allowed people who have big trailers or access to large bales to basically try to corner the market. So in that microcosm, it has me wondering if we're starting to see this trend at a larger scale. If we're, as a result of the herd mentality, we're starting to see inflation or even potentially the risk of hyperinflation. As anytime these products go out of stock, when they return to shelves, when they return to the marketplace, it's always at a much higher price. So the concern is not necessarily the stupidity of herd mentality, but the potential exploitation of it. Of course, the notion of herd psychology also applies to disinformation. It also applies to the way in which we learn, and in particular the way in which we learn about our world. And while we like to joke that we're in a renaissance of conspiracy theory, a kind of golden age of disinformation, I think it also reflects the way in which our herd psychology is changing, and the way in which we think not as individuals, but as a pack, as a collective. If the people we love and trust believe in some QAnon conspiracy theory, chances are so will we. Or conversely, if we don't, it'll be very difficult for us to stay in that herd, to remain in that family because of the collective nature of those beliefs. So I think it's a mistake to assume that as individuals we might have the critical thinking skills, but instead recognize the need for critical thinking skills at the herd level. That when we think critically, we need to do so as a group. Not just because we find meaning and value in the group, but because that's where we're most vulnerable to believing things that we ought not to, because that's what everyone else thinks as well. As a goat herd, I can't really control these goats. I can influence them, I can guide them, I'm here to protect them, but they tend to go where they want. Unless, of course, I provide a kind of leadership that helps them get what they want. And that's partly part of what makes walking with goats so enjoyable. But it also reflects our relationship to our herds. We can't control our herds. They can certainly control us. But if we provide a kind of leadership, if we provide a kind of guidance that helps them get what they want, well, that's where as leaders we can make the most of living in a herd and being part of a herd-centric economy. We don't normally have bells on these guys, but because it is the end of fall and near the onset of winter, there's not a lot of food for them to eat. So they tend to wander where they want. So it's good to have metrics. It's good to have signals so that we can get a sense of what the herd is up to and what the herd is interested in, which begs the metaphor that maybe there's other sorts of signals out in the world that we should be listening to, like these bells, so we get a sense of what the rather larger herd is up to and how we can engage with it. Let us also not forget that sometimes the herd can be a little overwhelming. Don't you think, Federica? Yes, I don't have any treats left, but I know you're interested. This is when you got to be a little careful with the herd, in no small part due to their size. But they do tend to be pretty friendly, as long as you give them the treats they want on occasion. Isn't that right? Yes. Isn't that right, buddy? Yes. Finally, the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to herd psychology is privacy. Increasingly, our privacy, our private information, the protection of our data is not based on individual practices. It's based on our relationships. It's based on collective practices. You're not only as smart as your friends, you're also only as private as your friends. I mean, let's not forget, they're the ones who post photos of you, who tag you, who are most likely to rat you out to the great algorithms in the web. That's why it's important to not just think of the herd psychology when it comes to protection, but also when it comes to the protection of your information.